The relentless summer sun beat down upon the cracked earth, a shimmering haze distorting the distant, unforgiving horizon, as May, barely 18 and clutching a worn satchel against her brown prairie dress, stumbled onward, each step kicking up plumes of fine dust that seemed to cling to her very soul. Her delicate features, though smudged with travel and etched with a weariness that belied her youth, held a quiet, unyielding strength, a testament to the arduous journey that had brought her to this desolate stretch of land, a place where whispers of opportunity were as scarce and fleeting as a cool breeze. The vast, empty expanse swallowed her small frame, emphasizing the terrifying isolation that had become her constant companion since leaving behind the crowded, familiar chaos of the ports. Driven by a desperation she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, even in the deepest recesses of her weary mind. She saw it then, a smudge on the distant landscape that slowly resolved into a cluster of weathered structures, a ranch house squatting low beneath the immense sky, its wooden walls bleached to a silvery gray by years of sun and neglect, a single, spindly windmill turning lazily, like a silent, hopeful prayer against the immense indifference of the world. Her throat was a raw, aching desert, her lips cracked and dry, but a spark, faint yet persistent, flickered within her, fueled by the primal instinct for survival, for a chance, however slim, to simply exist, to earn her keep, to find a corner where she might mend the shattered pieces of her life. Every muscle screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain, the image of that distant ranch house morphing into a fragile beacon, a potential haven in this harsh, unwelcoming wilderness, a place where perhaps, just perhaps, her pleas for work would not be met with the same cold indifference or outright hostility she had so often encountered along the dusty trails. The heat pressed down, a suffocating blanket, and she could feel the last drops of water sloshing in her canteen, a grim reminder of her dwindling resources and the stark reality that this, truly, was her last hope. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, a small, fragile sound in the immensity, and the steady, resolute beat of her heart, a drum against the silence, carrying her forward, one painful step after another, towards the ranch that held her uncertain future. The air thrummed with the buzzing of unseen insects and the oppressive, unmoving heat as May finally reached the rickety fence line, her eyes scanning the sun-baked yard with a mixture of apprehension and stubborn resolve. A man emerged from the shadows of the porch, his frame broad and stooped, a weathered silhouette against the blinding afternoon light, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man carved from the very land he inhabited. This was Cole, she knew from the whispered directions of a sympathetic stable hand miles back, the solitary rancher whose reputation for quiet tenacity preceded him, a man whose gaze held the deep, enduring lines of a life lived beneath too many open skies. His eyes, when they finally settled upon her, were a surprising shade of pale blue, piercing through the weariness that clouded her own, assessing her with a directness that lacked malice but carried an undeniable weight. She swallowed, the sound grating in her dry throat, and found her voice, a small, reedy thing that seemed to catch on the parched air. "Sir," she began, her tone earnest, imbued with the full measure of her desperate need, "I am looking for work. Any work. I am strong. I learn quickly. I can cook, clean, tend to animals. I am willing to do anything." She held his gaze, refusing to flinch, allowing him to see the raw vulnerability in her eyes, but also the steely determination that shone through, a desperate hope clinging to her every word. Cole merely nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching out, taut and heavy between them, filled only with the relentless hum of the summer day and the unspoken anxieties that clawed at her. He wiped a hand across his brow, pushing back strands of gray hair that escaped his hat, and then gestured vaguely towards the empty water trough beside the barn. "It's dry," he said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle yet firm, a voice accustomed to long silences and the solitude of the frontier, a voice that carried the weight of years. His words, simple as they were, hinted at the harsh realities of this land, the constant battle against nature's indifference, and the quiet struggle of survival that defined life here, echoing her own unspoken battles. She waited, every nerve ending alert, sensing the profound gravity of this moment, the precipice upon which her entire future teetered, knowing that his next words would either offer a lifeline or plunge her back into the terrifying abyss of uncertainty. Cole's steady gaze softened only slightly, a fleeting shift in the pale blue depths that hinted at something deeper than mere pragmatism, a glimmer of understanding perhaps, or a profound weariness mirroring her own. He took another slow breath, the silence in the sun-drenched yard stretching thin, almost painfully so, before he finally spoke, his voice low but clear, cutting through the oppressive heat like a stark truth. "A servant," he murmured, more to himself than to her, his eyes drifting towards the vast, empty fields that shimmered beyond the small ranch, as if seeing not just the baked earth, but the long, lonely years he had spent tilling it, fighting against its stubborn resistance, his own silent battle against the encroaching wilderness. He turned his attention back to May, his expression settling into something unyielding, yet not unkind. "I don't need a servant, child." The words hung in the air. A cold, hard stone dropped into the fragile pool of her hope, and May felt a sudden, sickening lurch in her stomach, the familiar, crushing weight of rejection already pressing down, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of defiance within her. Her shoulders slumped infinitesimally, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture of defeat, but she straightened quickly, refusing to show the full extent of the blow, her gaze still locked on his, searching for any scrap of possibility. Then he continued, his voice taking on a different timbre, a quiet, almost hesitant solemnity that caught her completely off guard. "I need a wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the relentless drone of the cicadas momentarily deafening, the very air vibrating with the unexpected pronouncement. May stared, her mind struggling to process the implications. The sheer, unimaginable audacity of the proposal, a sudden, brutal collision of her desperate search for survival and a future she had never dared to contemplate. Her breath caught in her throat, a choked gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs with a frantic, terrified rhythm, the words echoing in her ears like a distant, thunderous storm, shaking the very foundations of her carefully constructed defenses. It was not a question, not a plea, but a statement, stark and unadorned, offered with a quiet directness that left no room for misunderstanding, a demand for a different kind of labor, a different kind of belonging, one she had neither sought nor ever believed would be offered to her in this raw, unforgiving land. The sun, an indifferent witness, seemed to intensify its merciless glare, turning the air around May into a shimmering, suffocating wave as Cole's words settled upon her like a physical weight, heavy and inescapable. Her mind reeled, a chaotic whirlwind of shock, fear, and a desperate, agonizing calculation of her dwindling options. A wife. Not a servant, not a hired hand, but a wife. The word itself felt foreign on this desolate ranch, a soft, intimate concept utterly at odds with the harsh realities that had defined her existence since leaving her homeland, a world away across a vast, unforgiving ocean. She thought of the countless dusty miles she had covered, the meager provisions, the constant gnawing fear of starvation and exploitation, the weary resignation that had become a familiar companion. This man, old enough to be her father, spoke of a bond she had only heard whispered of in hushed tones, a sacred commitment. Yet here it was, presented to her as a cold, practical exchange for shelter, for sustenance, for the very chance to survive in this brutal, indifferent land. Her eyes involuntarily swept across the stark landscape, the parched fields, the solitary house. a desperate longing for home rising within her, a ache for the familiar faces, the comfort of her language, the warmth of a life unburdened by this impossible choice. But that life was gone, shattered by circumstances she could not control, and the bitter truth was that there was no going back, only forward, into this frightening, uncertain unknown. Her dignity, a fragile shield she had fiercely guarded through every hardship, felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable to this blunt, transactional offer. Was this the only way? To trade her youth, her very self, for a roof over her head, for food to fill her empty belly, for a precarious foothold in this unforgiving world? A deep internal struggle raged within her, a tempest of conflicting emotions. Terror at the thought of such a commitment to a stranger, a man she barely knew, and the equally profound terror of utterly failing, of succumbing to the brutal indifference of the wilderness. Her future, her very existence, hinged on this choice, a stark, agonizing crossroads where self-preservation demanded a sacrifice she had never imagined, a quiet, desperate bargain struck in the relentless heat of a western summer. With a heavy, almost imperceptible sigh, May finally spoke, her voice still thin but now infused with a fragile, hard-won resolve, a quiet acceptance of the stark bargain laid before her. I will do it. The words were not an enthusiastic assent, but a declaration born of sheer, unvarnished necessity, a choice made not with joy, but with a profound, solemn understanding of the immense weight and unfamiliar path they would lay out for her. Cole simply nodded again, his pale blue eyes still fixed on her, but the unreadable intensity in them seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly, as if a long-held tension had finally begun to ease within him. He turned without another word, a silent invitation for her to follow him into the dim interior of the ranch house, a space that would now, by her own difficult choice, become her home. The coolness inside was a welcome reprieve from the searing heat, a stark contrast that emphasized the sudden, dramatic shift in her circumstances. The house was sparsely furnished, practical rather than comfortable, a bachelor's dwelling, every object seemingly placed with a deliberate purpose, bearing the silent history of a solitary life. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that looked as if it had seen 100 meals and 1,000 lonely mornings. The small domestic details, the worn wooden floorboards, the faint scent of dust and old wood, the single unlit oil lamp on the mantel, spoke volumes of the quiet dignity and enduring solitude that permeated the space. A world utterly alien, yet now inextricably linked to her own. She walked slowly, her gaze taking in every detail, her mind already cataloging tasks, planning the arduous work that lay ahead, not as a servant, but as a silent, unwilling partner in this unexpected arrangement. Her satchel, still clutched in her hand, felt heavier now, weighted not just with her few meager possessions, but with the unspoken vows she had just made, the profound shift in her destiny. The quiet hum of the afternoon returned, but now it was filled with the nascent sounds of her new life taking root in this desolate land. The distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the rustle of dry leaves against the window pane. May stood in the center of the small, silent room, a young woman adrift in a vast, unforgiving country, yet in her eyes, beneath the lingering fear, a flicker of resilience remained, a quiet defiance that would, she knew, be tested in the long, arduous days and silent, uncertain nights that lay ahead, as she began to navigate the complex, unspoken terms of her marriage to the old rancher. The days bled into weeks, each one a relentless cycle of sun-drenched labor and quiet, unfamiliar intimacy in the vast, indifferent landscape that now constituted May's world. The initial shock of Cole's proposal slowly gave way to the brutal, undeniable reality of her existence, a life defined by calloused hands, aching muscles, and the constant, rhythmic churn of daily chores. She rose before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and oranges, the air still holding a ghost of the night's coolness, a fleeting mercy before the sun asserted its dominion. Her tasks were endless, tending the meager garden where dusty greens struggled against the arid soil, hauling water from the well until her shoulders screamed in protest, cleaning the small Spartan house until every surface gleamed with a desperate cleanliness, and preparing simple, hearty meals that Cole ate in silence, his eyes often fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window, lost in thoughts she could only guess at. He rarely spoke, his presence a quiet, immovable force in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder of the profound, unspoken agreement that bound them. Yet, in his silence, there was no cruelty, only a profound sense of solitude that mirrored her own, a shared burden of quiet endurance in the face of a world that demanded strength without offering much in return. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he mended fences, his movements slow but sure, each swing of the hammer echoing with years of practiced labor. A man intrinsically linked to the land, etched into its very contours. And slowly, imperceptibly, a sliver of understanding began to bloom within her, a recognition of his own quiet resilience. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when their gazes would meet across the dusty yard, or over the supper table, a flicker of something unsaid passing between them, a shared acknowledgement of their strange, intertwined fate, a shared vulnerability beneath the harsh sun and the silent stars, creating a connection forged not in romance, but in the unyielding crucible of necessity, and a shared, desperate hope for survival, a fragile tendril of connection growing in the hard, unyielding ground of their unusual union. She found a strange comfort in the predictability of the days, in the rhythm of her tasks, a stark contrast to the tumultuous uncertainty that had preceded it, a new kind of grounding in the simple, arduous truth of the land, and the quiet, enduring presence of the man beside her. One sweltering afternoon, a week so hot the very air seemed to crackle, a crisis descended upon the ranch, stark and sudden, disrupting the fragile peace May had begun to cultivate. The windmill, their only source of fresh water, let out a tortured shriek, a metallic groan that tore through the quiet hum of the afternoon, before grinding to an abrupt, shuddering halt, its blades frozen mid-turn against the relentless blue sky. May, who had been meticulously cleaning the small pantry, rushed outside, her heart seizing with a primal fear as she saw Cole already standing beneath the towering structure, his head tilted back, his weathered face etched with a grim resignation that spoke volumes of the impending disaster. The well, they both knew, was the lifeline of the ranch, the very artery sustaining their existence in this arid land, and without its constant flow, the cattle would wither, the garden would die, and their own survival would become a terrifyingly finite countdown. Cole climbed the creaking ladder with a practiced slowness, each rung a testament to his age, the sun glinting off the tools he carried in his belt, a solitary figure battling against the merciless forces of nature. May watched him, a knot forming in her stomach, the sheer scale of the problem pressing down on her, the vulnerability of their isolated life suddenly laid bare. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting shadows and the increasingly desperate cries of the thirsty cattle. From below, May could hear the clanking of metal, the frustrated grunts from Cole, and a growing sense of helplessness began to creep in, a chill against the scorching heat, reminding her of her own limited strength in the face of such a formidable challenge. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, Cole finally descended, his shoulders slumped, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion, his pale eyes shadowed with defeat. "It's the main gear," he rasped, his voice rough, heavy with the weight of the pronouncement. "Broken clean through. No way to fix it without a new part, and that means a trip to town." The nearest town, a rough outpost of a few general stores and a saloon, was a full 2 days' journey by wagon, a perilous undertaking in this heat, a journey that would leave May alone on the ranch and the animals without water for days. A terrifying prospect that underscored the fragile threads by which their lives were held together in this harsh, unforgiving land. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken dread, the reality of their predicament pressing down on them with an unbearable weight, forcing them to confront the brutal truth of their precarious existence. The enormity of the broken windmill settled over them like a shroud, a palpable threat to their fragile foothold in this desolate land. Cole, his face a mask of weary determination, began to make preparations for his journey to town, a task that carried with it the unspoken risk of leaving the ranch and May vulnerable. "You'll have to manage the well by hand," he instructed, his gaze sweeping across her delicate frame, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "The bucket is heavy and the rope chafes. Keep an eye on the animals, and," he added, his voice dropping, "keep the rifle loaded. There have been whispers of drifters passing through." May's heart pounded at the mention of the rifle, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond the ranch's worn fences, yet she met his gaze with a fierce, newfound resolve. "I will," she affirmed, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor that shook her insides. As Cole harnessed the team, the creak of leather and the jingle of bit, a lonely counterpoint to the oppressive silence, May began the arduous task of drawing water from the deep well. Each bucket was a monumental effort, the rope biting into her hands, her muscles screaming in protest. But she pushed through the pain, driven by the desperate need to keep the animals alive, to sustain the small, struggling garden that represented their fragile hope. The sun beat down mercilessly, her clothes sticking to her skin, sweat stinging her eyes, but she refused to yield. She would not let them perish. She would not fail. As the dust cloud of Cole's wagon disappeared over the distant horizon, leaving her utterly alone in the vast, echoing silence, a profound sense of isolation settled over her, but it was tinged with a strange, empowering surge of strength. She was the sole guardian of this small, desperate world, and she would stand defiant against the harshness of the land, against the unseen threats, against the crushing weight of her solitude. It was a baptism by fire, a crucible that forged her resilience in the relentless heat of the western sun, stripping away the last vestiges of her youthful naivety, leaving behind a woman hardened by circumstance, yet imbued with an unwavering spirit, a quiet, fierce determination to survive, to prove her worth, not just to Cole, but to herself, facing the daunting challenge of the ranch with a quiet, resolute defiance that belied her fragile appearance. The days of Cole's absence stretched into an eternity, each hour marked by the rhythmic, agonizing labor at the well, the aching protests of her muscles, and the constant vigilance against the unseen dangers of the frontier. May's hands became raw and calloused, her back a perpetual ache, but with each bucket of water she hauled, each thirsty animal she tended, a quiet strength settled deeper within her, hardening her resolve like sun-baked clay. She moved through the ranch with a newfound purpose, her senses acutely aware of every rustle in the dry brush, every distant howl, every shadow that lengthened with the setting sun. The rifle, once an intimidating symbol of violence, now rested beside her, a heavy, cold comfort, a silent promise of protection in a world that offered little mercy. She learned to listen to the land, to anticipate the needs of the animals, to read the subtle signs of changing weather, finding a profound connection to the earth that had once seemed utterly alien. One evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery, dramatic strokes, a lone rider appeared on the dusty road, his silhouette stark against the fading light. May's heart leaped into her throat, a primal fear seizing her, the whispered warnings of drifters echoing in her mind. She snatched up the rifle, her hands trembling, and stood her ground on the porch, a small, defiant figure against the encroaching darkness. The rider approached slowly, his horse kicking up plumes of dust. And as he drew closer, she recognized him, a neighbor from a distant ranch, a quiet, weathered man named Silas, who had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with Cole. He dismounted, his gaze respectful, almost apologetic. "Heard Cole was in town for the windmill part," Silas said, his voice low, his eyes falling on the dry fields. "Thought I'd check if you needed anything. Saw your cattle were looking thirsty." The simple act of kindness, the unexpected gesture of community in this desolate expanse, brought an unexpected wellspring of emotion to May, a profound sense of relief washing over her, easing the crushing weight of her solitude. In that moment, surrounded by the vast and different landscape, the presence of another human being, offering quiet solidarity, felt like a lifeline, a testament to the fragile yet enduring bonds that could form even in the harshest of circumstances, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared struggle against the relentless wilderness, softening the edges of her overwhelming fear. Finally, on the morning of the fourth day, as the sun began its familiar ascent, painting the sky in soft, hopeful hues, the distant rumble of Cole's wagon broke the oppressive silence, a sound that resonated through May's weary body like a profound, long-awaited melody. She watched its slow approach, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and a strangely unfamiliar emotion she couldn't quite name, a quiet surge of feeling that transcended mere gratitude. As the wagon pulled into the yard, a new gleaming gear strapped securely to its side, Cole's eyes, tired but steady, met hers, and in that brief, unspoken exchange, a profound understanding passed between them, a recognition of the shared ordeal, the silent struggle, and the quiet triumph of her endurance. He descended from the wagon with a careful slowness, his movements stiff from the long journey, and for the first time May noticed a subtle softening in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of her unwavering resilience, of the strength she had demonstrated in his absence. "You managed well," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of surprise but imbued with a deep, quiet respect that spoke more eloquently than any torrent of words, a rare and precious validation in this world of stoic endurance. May merely nodded, a small, weary smile touching her lips, her gaze sweeping across the ranch, now verdant with the promise of future water, the animals already stirring with a renewed vitality. The sight of the new gear, glinting in the morning sun, symbolized not just the repair of the windmill, but a deeper, more fundamental repair in the fabric of their lives, a quiet mending of the threads that bound them together. As Cole began the arduous task of climbing the windmill once more, the sun catching the silver of his hair, May started to draw water, the rhythm of the bucket no longer a painful burden, but a testament to her newfound strength, a quiet affirmation of her place here. The future, she knew, would still be fraught with challenges, with the relentless demands of the land. But as she watched Cole, a solitary figure against the vast blue sky, and felt the familiar bite of the rope in her hands, she understood that she was no longer merely surviving. She was building something, brick by painstaking brick, a life forged in the crucible of hardship, bound by an unspoken, growing connection to the quiet man who had offered her a choice, a chance, a future in this wild, beautiful, and endlessly challenging land. The vastness of the prairie, once a terrifying symbol of her isolation, now seemed to hold a different promise, an open expanse not of emptiness, but of quiet possibility, a canvas upon which they would, together, paint the enduring story of their unexpected union.